What is chronological snobbery in C.S. Lewis, and also is that relevant for us today?
I think it is a very relevant idea. For Lewis, chronological snobbery is simply the idea, old ideas, they're defunct, they're useless. The most recent is the best. In other words, innovation, novelty, that's what we need. And Lewis is saying, no, what we need to realize is there is wisdom in the past. What is new today will be out of date tomorrow. It's ephemeral. It's not permanent. It's not stable. And what Lewis is saying is let's rediscover the classics, because in many ways they're able to say, here is something that's been tried and tested and still speaks to us today. For example, Plato, but more importantly, of course, the New Testament. And that, I think, is a very important point, because as I look at modern Western culture, I see this obsession with innovation. You have to have the most recent. And then you discover it doesn't satisfy us. You look for something even more recent, and there's this constant unsatisfied quest for what is the most recent, and it completely fails to satisfy you. Lewis is saying there are things that satisfy. People have found them, they've written about them, and by reading the rich wisdom of the past, for example, the New Testament, you are put in touch with something that is going to satisfy. So for Lewis, the modern Western obsession with innovation is a sign of human restlessness, a sign that nothing that is created or finite is really able to satisfy us, which raises the question, what is there that really can satisfy? And for Lewis, of course, the answer is the Christian faith, and that is written down in many forms. And by looking at those, for example, in Augustine, in the New Testament, in Thomas Aquinas, in Dante, in Lewis even, you find there's something that satisfies and makes you say, that is what it's all about.
So C.S. Lewis thinks that newer is not always better. And you mentioned Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Dante. So you mentioned some medieval philosophers and authors. And we know that C.S. Lewis took inspiration from medieval literature, and he was also a literary critic and worked on that as well. Now, in your book, The Intellectual World of C.S. Lewis, you talk about the art of memory, ars memorativa. You also talk about imagination and building imaginative story. You talk about these two concepts, and you say that Surprised by Joy should be read in its context as an autobiography, as a biography, in the same way you would read Augustine's Confessions, for instance. So what role does the art of memory play in C.S. Lewis, and also imagination?
I think whether we look at Augustine with his Confessions or with C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy, what we see is the recollection of a life which has led from unbelief to God, and the realization that this process of recollection actually enables you to realize what it is about Christianity that really spoke to you, that changed you, and hence is something you can pass on to others. So if you like, Lewis is telling his own story. If you like, it's the journey of a soul. But Lewis is implying anybody who accompanies me on this journey is going to end up, thinking very similar thoughts. If you like, it's almost like apologetics through a personal narration. And I find that very compelling because I like reading biographies, and very often I find myself entering into them and trying to imagine what this is like. And that's what Lewis is doing. He's saying, journey with me, see what I see, think what I think, and see if this makes as much sense to you as it did to me. So in many ways what Lewis is doing is rediscovering the art of memory, the art of narration apologetically. This is something that will connect with people, and your personal narrative of discovery of faith can be a vehicle for helping others to discover the same thing. Now that's important, because I know many people who would say, well, look, I'm not a very able philosopher, I can't really argue very well, but I can tell my story. And what Lewis is saying was, I've done that too, and let me encourage you to do that. Now, Lewis does a lot more than that, but one of the things he does so well is to tell his own story in the hope that this might help somebody else redirect their story.
I think you're putting your finger on something very important there, in that not all people are able to go into debates and be apologists and defend the Christian faith. But what we can do is to tell our own story. And that's very meaningful and powerful, as C.S. Lewis points out. Now, you also mentioned briefly that we have something in us, within us, that's longing for something eternal, for something outside of this world. And this is known as the argument from desire. Now, as we know, this is not an actual philosophical argument. It's simply an analogy, and this idea that we all have a deep longing in us that cannot be like a thirst, that cannot be quenched by anything in the real world. So it follows that there must be a God who is the only one outside of this world who's able to satisfy that. And I was surprised to see in your book that you even quoted Bertrand Russell saying the same, very similar things. So I quote, Russell said, "The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite." What is this longing that C.S. Lewis talks about, and what does it mean for us? Where does it take us?
I think this is a very important point. Lewis here is almost using a theological framework. He's saying, look, we've been created by God to relate to God. And once you accept that framework, you can see immediately that if we do not relate to God, there's a sense of absence. There's an emptiness within us where there ought to be a presence. And so Lewis's argument is that we feel that absence even though we don't necessarily know what it is. And what Christianity does is to name that. It says, this is what this really is. And once you see that, you know what to do to make this come true. Now, the reason I quoted Bertrand Russell is, of course, he was a well-known atheist. But Lewis is saying this is a human experience. We all have this because we've all been made by God, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. And as a result, we feel this emptiness. And so for Lewis, one of the things that Christianity does is not simply give us a new vision of reality, a new way of understanding the world, but also it is about fulfilling this relational absence that we feel at the moment. In other words, we come home to God and we have this sense of fulfillment which otherwise we cannot have. And so for Lewis, this human experience of emptiness is a very important starting point for an apologist, because it's there. And you can talk about Christianity not so much as a set of ideas, but rather as fulfilling who we are, what we're meant to be. It's about, in effect, directly engaging this sense of emptiness that so many people have in their lives. And it names it, and it shows what it points to, and says, this can be changed. And I think what Lewis is doing there is giving us a very powerful apologetic tool, which speaks to people who might not be interested in arguments, but have this sense of, well, there has to be more than this, or a sense that I'm not really the person I ought to be, or a sense that there has to be more to life than what I have. And that, I think, is very significant. Not many other apologists do that, but it's part of Lewis's overall approach to Christian apologetics.